On Monday, the President of the United States declared that Washington and Tehran were having productive conversations that could end the war in the Middle East. On Tuesday morning, Iranian ballistic missiles tore through apartment buildings in Tel Aviv. This is the paradox defining the fourth week of the most consequential military confrontation in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a war in which diplomacy and devastation are advancing simultaneously, each claiming the upper hand. For nearly a month, the United States and Israel have been striking Iran while Iran has been retaliating across the region. And no one, not the world's most powerful governments, not the markets, not the millions of civilians caught in the crossfire, can tell whether the next chapter will be written in negotiating rooms or in the craters left by warheads. What happened on March 24th reveals just how thin the line between de-escalation and catastrophe has become. On Tuesday, March 24, 2026, Iran launched multiple waves of ballistic missiles at Israel, firing at least 8 separate salvos throughout the day, according to the Israel Defense Forces. Impacts were reported at 4 sites across the country, including a direct strike on central Tel Aviv that left a large crater in a residential street and tore gaping holes through a multi-story apartment building. Israel's Magen David Adom Emergency Medical Service reported 6 people lightly injured across the country. A separate Hezbollah rocket attack killed 1 woman in northern Israel. The strikes came less than 24 hours after President Donald Trump posted an all-capitals message on Truth Social claiming that the United States and Iran had engaged in very good and productive conversations regarding a complete and total resolution of our hostilities in the Middle East. Trump said he had ordered a 5-day postponement of planned strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure to allow talks to continue. His deadline, a 48-hour ultimatum for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz issued on Saturday, was effectively suspended. The response from Tehran was swift and categorical. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of Iran's parliament, whom Israeli officials and other sources identified as the Iranian interlocutor in the purported talks, wrote on X that no negotiations had taken place. He described the claims as disinformation aimed at manipulating financial and oil markets. Iran's foreign ministry echoed the denial, though it acknowledged that regional countries had been making initiatives to reduce tensions. The disconnect was total. Trump spoke of major points of agreement. Iran said there was nothing to agree on. Meanwhile, the Israeli military announced that its jets had carried out a major wave of strikes on central Tehran on Monday, hitting command centers associated with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps intelligence arm and the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence. The IDF reported destroying more than 50 additional targets overnight, including ballistic missile storage and launch facilities. Air defense systems in Tehran were activated as explosions echoed across the capital. To understand the missile salvos of March 24th, one needs to trace the chain of events back to the collapse of nuclear negotiations and the decision that set this conflict into motion. The current war did not erupt spontaneously. It is the product of decades of mutual hostility between Iran and the United States, compounded by failed diplomacy and a pattern of escalation that has accelerated dramatically since 2024. The roots are familiar. Tensions between Washington and Tehran have simmered since the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the hostage crisis that followed. But the immediate precursors to this war began with the collapse of the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear deal from which the United States withdrew in 2018 during Trump's first term. Subsequent rounds of sanctions devastated the Iranian economy, and multiple attempts to renegotiate a deal faltered. In June 2025, after earlier rounds of nuclear talks broke down, Israel launched a 12-day military campaign against Iran, striking military sites, nuclear facilities, and regime infrastructure. Iran retaliated with hundreds of missiles and drones aimed at Israel, killing 28 Israeli civilians. That war ended with a ceasefire, but left deep scars and depleted trust on both sides. The aftermath of the 12-day war set the stage for what came next. Iran's currency went into freefall. New international sanctions were reimposed. By December 2025, massive anti-government protests erupted across Iran, driven by economic collapse and political frustration. Iranian security forces responded with lethal force, killing thousands of protesters in what became the largest domestic repression since the revolution itself. The protests and the crackdown drew sharp condemnation from the United States, and Trump began moving naval and air assets into the region at a pace not seen since the buildup to the Iraq War. In February 2026, a new round of indirect nuclear negotiations began in Muscat, Oman. 3 rounds of talks took place over the course of the month. On February 27, just one day before the strikes began, Oman's Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi publicly declared a breakthrough, saying Iran had agreed to downgrade its enriched uranium stockpile and accept full verification by the International Atomic Energy Agency. He said peace was within reach. It was not. On February 28, the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury, a coordinated wave of strikes targeting Iranian leadership, military installations, missile production sites, and the remnants of the country's nuclear program. Among those killed was Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with the defense minister, several IRGC generals, and hundreds of military personnel. Trump framed the operation as a regime change effort, calling on the Iranian people to overthrow their government. Iran's retaliation was sweeping. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles were fired at Israel and at United States military bases across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The war has now been raging for nearly 4 weeks. The geopolitical chessboard of this conflict is dense with overlapping interests, competing calculations, and fragile alliances. The United States, under President Trump, has framed this war around 4 stated objectives: preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, destroying its missile arsenal and production capacity, degrading its proxy networks, and eliminating its naval capability. The unstated but widely recognized 5th objective is regime change. Trump has repeatedly called on the Iranian people to rise up, and his administration has made clear that it envisions a different government in Tehran. Domestically, however, the war is politically contentious. An NPR-PBS Newsmarist poll found that 56% of Americans oppose the conflict. Rising gasoline prices, up more than $1 per gallon in a single month, are creating acute economic pressure on American households. Israel, under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, has been closely aligned with the United States throughout the campaign. Israeli forces have conducted extensive strikes on Iranian military and intelligence infrastructure, and the IDF has reported destroying or disabling a significant portion of Iran's missile launchers. For Netanyahu, the war represents an opportunity to neutralize what Israel has long described as an existential threat: Iran's nuclear program and its network of armed proxies, particularly Hezbollah. However, the continued missile strikes on Israeli territory, including the use of cluster munitions in residential areas, demonstrate that the threat has not been eliminated. Israeli officials have reportedly told counterparts that they consider it highly unlikely Iran would accept American demands in any renewed negotiations. Iran, now under the new Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, elected on March 8 to replace his father, faces a dual crisis: military degradation and domestic legitimacy. The country's missile launches have declined from roughly 90 per day at the start of the war to around 10, according to IDF assessments, a reduction attributed to the destruction of launchers and a strategy of rationing for a prolonged conflict. Yet Iran retains the ability to strike across the region, as the March 24 attacks on Israel demonstrate. Tehran's strategic leverage centers on the Strait of Hormuz, which it has effectively blockaded, disrupting roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas supply. Iran has signaled that it will not reopen the strait until its conditions are met, and has warned that any attack on its energy infrastructure would trigger retaliatory strikes on the energy systems of United States allies in the region. Pakistan has emerged as a potential diplomatic intermediary. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif declared on Tuesday that Islamabad stands ready to host negotiations between the United States and Iran. A Pakistani official said direct talks could take place in Islamabad as early as this week, though no confirmation has come from either Washington or Tehran. China, a major strategic partner of Iran and one of the few countries whose shipping has been permitted through the Strait of Hormuz, has called on all parties to halt military operations. Beijing's special envoy to the Middle East, Zhai Jun, warned that continued fighting would plunge the region into chaos. China's position is complicated by its dependence on Middle Eastern energy and its desire to avoid being drawn into a confrontation with the United States, while simultaneously maintaining influence with Tehran. The economic fallout from this war has been staggering, and the events of March 24 only deepened the uncertainty roiling global markets. The most immediate impact has come through the Strait of Hormuz. Under normal conditions, roughly 20% of the world's oil and a significant share of liquefied natural gas transit this narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. Since the start of the conflict, shipping through the strait has virtually ground to a halt. Iran has permitted passage for vessels linked to countries it considers friendly or neutral. Turkey, India, and China have managed to get some ships through, but the overall disruption has been massive. The International Energy Agency has described it as the largest supply disruption in the history of the oil market. IEA member nations agreed on March 11 to release a record 400 million barrels from strategic stockpiles. Oil prices have been on a roller coaster. When Trump announced his claims of productive negotiations on Monday, Brent crude fell nearly 11% to just under $100 per barrel, while West Texas Intermediate dropped more than 10%. Stock markets surged, but those gains were immediately threatened on Tuesday, when Galibaf denied any talks had occurred and Iranian missiles struck Tel Aviv again. Goldman Sachs raised its oil forecast sharply, projecting Brent crude to average $110 in March and April, and warned that if straight flows remain at 5% of normal levels for 10 weeks, daily Brent prices could exceed their 2008 record. The damage extends far beyond oil prices. Qatar's Ras Laffan liquefied natural gas port, the world's largest, was struck by Iranian bombardment, and Qatari authorities have said full restoration could take years. American consumers are paying directly. The national average gasoline price reached $3.96 per gallon, up more than $1 in a single month, the steepest one-month increase since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Diesel has topped $5 a gallon, raising transportation and shipping costs across the economy. Goldman Sachs has suggested that elevated energy prices could persist through 2027 if the conflict is not resolved. The wider global economy is straining. European markets initially surged on Trump's negotiation claims but retreated as reality set in. Gold prices fell more than 3% on Monday, continuing their worst stretch since 1983. The IEA's executive director, Fatih Birol, warned that the current situation is far more severe than the oil shocks of the 1970s or the disruption caused by the Russia-Ukraine war. The central question, whether the war is heading toward negotiation or further escalation, divides analysts sharply. Those who see a diplomatic opening point to the very fact that Trump pulled back from his ultimatum on Iranian power plants. According to Axios, United States envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner had been in contact with Galibaf, Iran's parliamentary speaker. Trump told reporters that the discussions had yielded major points of agreement, including Iran's commitment to never possess nuclear weapons and a willingness to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. If these claims have any substance, they would represent a significant shift from the Iranian position at the start of the war. Trump said he did not want to identify the Iranian interlocutor by name, saying he did not want to get him killed. The skeptics, and they are numerous, argue that the evidence for meaningful negotiations is thin to non-existent. Iran's foreign ministry has flatly denied any direct or indirect talks with Washington. Galibaf himself called the claims disinformation. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghaei said that Iran has held no negotiations since the war began, and characterized Trump's announcement as an attempt to lower energy prices and buy time for military plans. This view has traction. Iran's own position, as stated by its foreign ministry, is that all peace initiatives from regional countries must be referred to Washington, since Iran considers itself the party that was attacked, not the aggressor. The Arms Control Association published an analysis in March arguing that the United States negotiating team, led by Witkoff and Kushner, lacked the technical expertise necessary for serious nuclear diplomacy, and that their mischaracterization of Iran's positions may have contributed to the breakdown of talks before the war began. This critique suggests that even if a new diplomatic window opens, the structural problems that undermined earlier negotiations remain unresolved. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, 3 rounds of negotiations in February broke down over core disagreements whether Iran's ballistic missile program and proxy networks would be included in any deal, and whether Iran would be allowed to continue any level of uranium enrichment. These are not minor technical details. They go to the heart of what each side considers non-negotiable. Several regional analysts have noted that the war's continuation may be driven less by strategic calculation and more by domestic politics on all sides. Trump needs a resolution before economic damage erodes his political standing. Netanyahu needs to demonstrate that Israel's security has been enhanced, not degraded. And the new Iranian leadership under Mojtaba Khamenei needs to establish authority in a country that has lost its supreme leader, much of its senior military command, and a significant portion of its military infrastructure, all while facing a population scarred by protest and repression. Halima Croft, head of global commodity strategy at RBC Capital Markets, captured the market's skepticism with a memorable acronym. She referred to the situation with the Wall Street shorthand, "Taco Trump always chickens out." Her assessment was blunt. She did not believe the announcement marked the beginning of the end of the conflict. The reverberations of this war extend far beyond the Middle East, reshaping energy markets, alliances, and humanitarian conditions across multiple continents. In Iran itself, the humanitarian toll has been severe. The rights group Hrana documented over 3,100 deaths in the first 18 days, including more than 1,300 civilians. The Iranian Red Crescent Society reported that more than 67,000 civilian sites had been struck, including nearly 500 schools and more than 200 health facilities. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, warned that attacks on energy infrastructure, including Iran's South Pars gas field and Qatar's Ras Laffan port, could trigger disastrous humanitarian and environmental consequences lasting years. The UN Refugee Agency estimated that up to 3.2 million Iranians have been temporarily displaced, with particular concern for the 1.65 million refugees already in Iran, most of them from Afghanistan, who now face displacement for a second or third time. In Lebanon, the conflict has triggered a parallel crisis. Israeli strikes against Hezbollah targets have killed more than 1,000 people, according to Lebanese government figures, and displaced over 1 million. Israel's defense minister has threatened to apply what he called the Gaza model in Lebanon, raising international alarm about the potential for further destruction of civilian areas. In the Gulf states, Iranian retaliatory strikes have hit targets in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, killing civilians and military personnel. The strikes on energy infrastructure, particularly Qatar's LNG facilities, have implications that extend well beyond the region, threatening long-term supply contracts with Europe and Asia. For the United States, the domestic economic impact is the most immediate concern. The surge in gasoline prices, combined with rising diesel costs, is filtering into consumer prices across the economy. 13 American service members have been killed in Iranian attacks across the region, and the Pentagon has dispatched thousands of additional troops from the 82nd Airborne Division to the Middle East. China and India, both major consumers of Middle Eastern energy, are navigating a delicate balance. China has managed to maintain limited shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, while also urging restraint and positioning itself as a potential mediator. India has also secured passage for some vessels, but the disruption has forced both countries to adjust their energy sourcing strategies. Europe, which was already grappling with energy transition challenges, faces the prospect of a sustained energy price shock. The joint statement from the United Kingdom, France, and Germany condemned the Iranian counterstrikes but also called for a return to diplomacy. Britain has deployed military assets in a defensive role to protect bases in Qatar, Jordan, Iraq, and Cyprus, though Prime Minister Keir Starmer has stated explicitly that he does not believe in regime change from the skies. Several critical markers will determine whether the coming days bring a path toward talks or a further plunge into escalation. First, the 5-day window. Trump's announced pause on strikes against Iranian energy infrastructure creates a ticking clock. If no tangible progress toward negotiations materializes by the end of this week, the threat of strikes against power plants returns, and with it, the prospect of Iranian retaliation against regional energy infrastructure. Second, the Pakistan Channel. Prime Minister Sharif's offer to host talks in Islamabad is the most concrete diplomatic proposal on the table. Whether both sides agree to attend, and whether the discussions have any formal standing or authority, will be the first real test of whether diplomacy has a chance. Third, the Strait of Hormuz. The waterway remains the single most consequential lever in this conflict. Any movement toward reopening, or any new attacks on shipping, will immediately register in global oil prices and in the political calculations of every government involved. Fourth, Iran's missile capacity. The IDF has claimed significant success in destroying Iranian launchers, and the rate of fire has declined markedly. But the March 24 strikes on Tel Aviv show that Iran retains the capability to hit Israeli territory. Whether Iran can sustain its current pace of attacks or escalates with heavier payloads will shape both the military and diplomatic trajectory. Fifth, domestic pressures. American gasoline prices, Iranian civilian casualties, Israeli public anxiety about missile defense failures, and the question of whether Iran's new supreme leader will consolidate or fracture internal power. All of these factors are shaping the decisions of leaders who may be running out of room to maneuver. What March 24 revealed is a conflict trapped between two incompatible realities. In one, the war is approaching a negotiated resolution. Talks are underway, points of agreement exist, and the adults in the room are working toward an off-ramp. In the other, missiles are still flying, civilians are still dying, global energy markets are still convulsing, and the parties involved cannot even agree on whether they are speaking to each other. For the millions of people in Iran, Israel, Lebanon, and the Gulf states whose lives have been upended by this war, the distinction between these two narratives is not academic. It is the difference between shelter and rubble, between stability and collapse. The coming days will show which reality prevails, but the uncomfortable truth is that for now both appear to be simultaneously true.